Good afternoon and welcome to Building a Comprehensive Security Strategy for Network-Connected Medical Devices, a Health System CIO Media Inc. production sponsored by Imprivata. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Health System CIO and I will be your moderator today. We have some interactive features just to give you a heads up on. One is our agree or over the top poll, which is a chance for you to respond to some of the questions we put out there. We also encourage you to send in your questions or comments at any time and use the Q&A box for that. We'll take them later in the program. And you can also download the deck by using the URL on your screen. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time today, first we're going to go about 35 minutes with our panel discussion featuring Ron Mehring, CISO at Texas Health Resources, Art Ream, Senior Director of IT Applications and CISO with the Cambridge Health Alliance, and Christopher McKay, Director of Nursing and Clinical Workflow Specialist with Imprivata. So without further delay, I am going to jump right in. Ron, you want to start off by giving us an overview of your organization and your role?
Sure. Once again, like you said, my name is Ron Mehring. I serve as the Vice President of Technology and Security and our organization's Chief Information Security Officer. Texas Health Resources is a healthcare system in the North Texas area. We are a nonprofit, faith-based organization comprised of right around 25 hospitals and a little over 250 other points of care, normally referred to as our ambulatory setting. And that's Texas Health Resources.
Excellent. Very good. Art?
Yeah, my name is Arthur Ream. I'm the Senior Director of Applications and the Chief Information Security Officer for Cambridge Health Alliance. Cambridge is an academic community healthcare system which operates 3 hospitals and 19 primary care centers in Cambridge, Malden, and Everett in the Boston area. We're the Public Health Commission for the City of Cambridge, and we have a significant large outreach community program and medical staff that actually works a lot in our community areas. We're also a large behavioral health system as well, inpatient, outpatient treatment, and cover the less fortunate populations of the Massachusetts-Boston regional area. HIMSS stage 6 and 7, respectively. 6 is our inpatient, and 7 is our ambulatory. We have 15 primary care practices as well that are not hospital-based.
All right. Very good, Art. Thank you. Christopher?
Well, thanks. Thanks very much, Anthony. My name is Christopher McKay, Director of Nursing, Clinical Workflow Specialist for Imprivata. I've been with the company for about 6 years, practicing nurse here in the Boston area. I've been working with Beth Israel for the last 18 years, most recently not downtown, but down in the community, out in the Needham site. As far as Imprivata, we're a digital identity access company that really deals with a lot of different security issues, and hopefully we can bring some of those to light today and see how, again, we can think about making that security a little bit more user-friendly for some of the clinicians, and that's really what I'm going to focus on, is the clinical view.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. All right, next question. Define the Internet of Medical Things. What does it include, not include? Are there gray areas? And if so, what do they cover? I'm always interested in definitions of something like that and the importance that they have and the relevance they have to the work that needs to be done. You define things differently. You create different scope of what's included in it. So, Art, let me start with you.
Sure. I think we have somewhat of a gray area as well. So Internet of Medical Things I term as not only the biomedical equipment that we actually have roaming around the hospitals that do patient care across the board, but we also have inbound devices that we actually issue to patients that take home that use some type of connectivity through their phone to talk to our EHRs. There's potential egress there. And we also have everything that's walking in the door, like Fitbit and reporting items like that. So it's the Internet of Medical things. So anything that would end up with medical reporting, you have the Holter monitors, things like that that we send out with patients that have PHI in it and trying to protect it. So I think the scope of that is really large at this stage in the game and continues to get large with all the connectivity that they offer. Glucose monitors, for instance, I mean, those are patients that are connected and reporting back to our healthcare systems as well.
Very good. Ron?
I don't know if I would add all that much more to that, other just to amplify the mention of diversity, because Internet of Medical things or medical technology integrated into the acute or ambulatory settings, it's just a very diverse population. And what he alluded to, which is exactly right, this new outside the walls of the hospital or even the ambulatory patient care settings where we're starting to do much more work on the consumer patient-facing things at home and things like that. So I think his definition was spot on.
And I don't know, just real quick here to add to that, which probably is a totally different category. It's not a device, but there's this, and it could be another topic, is there's an increased interest in most hospital systems to have a portfolio of vendor-developed apps that do certain things for patients that record information and send it back and forth to the EHR with integration engines that are out there that are not, hospital-based. So you've got that, RESTful APIs that are pushing items into your, from applications that you want, like pain management, things like that. There's a whole host of areas. They're not necessarily devices, but they turn that human phone that you carry around into a device, essentially, really, when you carry it with you and use it.
I would add on one thing, because I think you guys really nailed it. I think that the definition of Internet of Medical Things 5 years ago, present day, and 5 years from now are 100% different every time you look at them, because there wasn't as much connectivity to the EMR. The things didn't feed in, vital sign monitors didn't push information into the EMR 10 years ago, whereas now it's a normal event. To Art's point, there's data and analytics being copied on devices that are being pushed in. Where is that landing? That pathway into your EMR is the challenge of that. The one thing I would say is that the four walls that I used to work in a hospital have been ripped down as far as the Internet of Things. I don't think it's ever just inside your hospital. To your point, outpatient, inpatient, mobile devices, telemedicine. I think the real true perimeter is your identity. I mean, that's what you really need to get into. You make sure that your identity for wherever you are, whether you're on that smartwatch or on a device or on something that's reporting back in like a Holter monitor, has that security. And that's a big challenge. I mean, I'm obviously not alone with knowing how much of a workflow impact that is to make sure that you're covering all those safety points. So I think it's definitely changing over the years as well.
Ron or Art, anything you want to comment?
I would just say, we could have a whole separate webinar on consumer identity and what all this means. I'll tell you that. He just led into something very important, exactly, and he was getting at it. And we could have a webinar just on the identity aspects around this and how that's changing. So great point.
Yep.
Well, maybe we will.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Art.
No, I definitely agree with that. That's a whole other topic we could get into.
All right, very good. Next question. What are the main challenges to providing security in this environment we're discussing, and what are the basic or foundational requirements, and why are they hard to achieve? So I guess you could think of it as stakes to play, and then higher end security at different grades, different levels, that type of a thing. Ron?
Well, the two challenges are, from my perspective, as just diversity in the medical device or the medical technology area. It's just diversity of devices and complexity of architecture. So those two things, when you meld them together and try and develop a security model around that, it becomes very complicated. And it's this whole balance, which I think we're going to talk about in a little bit, of it's kind of like a Venn diagram. It's like you have security in the middle, you've got privacy and confidentiality that bleeds into that security requirement, that robustness of control requirement, and then you have safety and reliability on the other side of that. So designing controls when you have a very diverse set of devices. In the IT world, in the traditional IT world, the diversity in the big scheme of things, it's not that diverse. You've got servers, you've got workstations, and mobile devices. And there's a little bit of mix of some other things. But generally speaking, it's not that diverse. Medical devices, we have all different kinds. And they have different protocols. They have different ways they communicate. Trying to design a security model around that. And I'm really talking about here inside the walls of our clinics or our hospitals. It's very complicated and maintaining that balance of safety and privacy, which is the security controls, really what it's trying to do in the middle of all that. So it becomes very complicated. The table stakes, the foundation of this, from my perspective, is really controlling access to the device, which from a network perspective is controlling data flow, and ensuring that we can effectively monitor for anomalies around those devices. In other words, is something bad happening, or are they operating normal? So those two, from my two things, are kind of the table stakes, the foundational aspects of what we're trying to do with that within that environment, and some of the issues with that, the complexity with that.
Very good, Art.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Ron on that and the diversity. I would add one other thing to that. Is added to our diversity, and the number of them is, a lot of these areas that we deal with these devices are regulated areas as well, and then the patching and the upgrading of each one of the operating systems or whatever's on the device comes at sometimes a cost of security. You can't update it because it hasn't gone through regulatory checks, and they're not ready to push that out. The same thing happens, not necessarily with medical devices, but when you start to look at the diagnostic world, they're highly regulated from blood bank regulations, lab regulations, and the FDA. And when you start even doing virus stuff on this or tracking with that, you end up being in the manufacturer's pipeline, and you can't do that. So you're reliant on when the manufacturer is going to push it out because it can impact the diagnostics of it. I think the same applies to the IoT devices that are inside our walls on our networks. You may have something that's out of compliance or has a vulnerability on it, but you can't touch it. So you got to think about a dynamic way, in my opinion, real time, to try to segment that, but yet still allow the use of that critical device without it having any potential impacts across the network. So it definitely speaks back to Ron's point. We're always in a diverse environment from just about every topic that falls underneath of those, and trying to architect and keep the controls dynamic enough around those is a challenge, and is a challenge to a healthcare IT team and security team.
Christopher, anything you want to add?
Yeah, the challenge is I'd add one more level to it, because the clinician doesn't want any of that to happen. They just want to get to the device and be able to access it. Right. And unfortunately, inside the four walls, we have to have that security because of the fact that it's going into your EMRs, being leveraged. It is a security potential breach point. So having that ease of use to get into these devices inside, especially some of the medical devices like pump vendors. And to Art's point, if you touch any of the code on one of these devices, you're now looking at an FDA approval that could be a 2-year window. So that adds a lot of challenges and requirements just to when you start thinking about adding that layer of security on this. So there's some big strategy behind some of even the things that we're trying to do 2 years out from now. So there's a lot of challenges just to maintain that and make it user friendly for the clinician.
Very good. All right, next question. Talk about the challenges of attaining and maintaining a good inventory of biomedical devices. I've definitely heard, that's why the RTLS has been popular, because you can't even find the stuff, and it's not that people are hiding it because they want to sell it. They're hiding it because they want to know where it is when they want to use it, right, Christopher? I mean, you're a nurse, you know that. My wife's a nurse, so you want to have that piece of equipment, and they disappear.
Yeah, we used to hide them in the closet. We know where they were, and then why is the patient's room full of IV pumps? Because we know where they are. That's where we can get them. Those have kind of gone by the wayside. I have to say that even bioengineering used to be something in the hospital that you would put a tag on, they would take it away, it would be gone for 2 and 3 weeks, and come back and fixed. Now they're reporting to the IT department, and that's part of the IT. I see a lot more the bioengineering falling directly in line with IT and it not being outsourced as much, and it's not something that's foreign. So yeah, there is some challenges to maintain that inventory, and I would say the challenge is not just that it's up and working, but it's connected correctly and you can authenticate to it. So those are the challenges I see.
Art?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, Cambridge outsources its biomedical team here, but particularly that entire department, biomedical, actually reports into the director and the senior director of infrastructure at CHA. So he's got a large number of controls over his equipment. I mean, and the plethora of equipment runs from connected devices to non-connected, obviously we know, because they deal with scopes and things like that that are not necessarily connected to the network. But those things that are, we've experimented in self-developing some tracking devices with some technology that he's put together that actually pays attention to the wireless devices in the ceiling and the access points and knows when it transfers from one access point to another, or knows what one it's closest to if you have 5 down a hallway or something like that. So some of those creative solutions, if you have the technology and or cheaper technology, you can actually program some little widget that we have done in-house here that has the floor plan on it with the access devices to track those. And then, like you said, again, the access to those devices, they want it now, they want it quick, they want to be able to log in if it's password protected, and they want it, you know, to be transparent just like they would a workstation in general, and give them their EHR as well as their other devices, yet have some controls around it. So it presents its own challenges, even when an outsourced group. Typically biomed, you're going to see them stop at the point where it hits the access point, whether it be a plugged-in device from a biomedical physiological device, or a roving device such as an insulin pump or something like that that's on the wheels. They'll stop when it starts to hit the hospital's infrastructure, and they don't know anything about that, you know, technology and the connectivity. Most of that is always handled by, you know, networking or IT. Unfortunately, having that group in IT, I think is a big benefit, or anybody should push to have that report to them, because you can't exist correctly without it, and having that oversight and change controls and the controls around it are important.
Ron?
Yeah, I don't know if I would add a whole bunch to that. Just at from a medical device perspective, let's say just for network-enabled medical devices that we're trying to keep track of and figure out where they're at. Number one, they don't have a standard set of protocols, so we can do what we do with traditional IT and inventory them through some type of technology, right, that helps identify what it actually is and all those things that go along what we do with traditional IT. So there's a lot of missing pieces on the medical device. We just don't have a lot of the same capabilities. So you have this kind of degree of separation where you're trying to figure out what it is and where it's at, and you don't have a lot of things that can give you that information, that can signal that information to you. Now, we've layered in technologies in our enterprise that does discovery on the network and figures out as best as it possibly can, by the way it's communicating, what is it, and then flows that information into our asset and inventory system on the medical device side. So there are some things that can help in inventory, but plain and simple, everything the issues I've already mentioned are the things that make this a very sticky thing to do in the environment. But we're compensating essentially for a lot of the deficiencies the medical devices have in basically self-reporting in what they are or what they are doing. So we're doing a lot of compensation, and with that, you're going to get a lot of variance, a lot of error, and so that's what we deal with in inventories and asset management in many cases, at least for network-enabled. Now, non-network-enabled, that's just a physical inventory process, and with that, you're always going to have a little bit of error. So we get involved with that occasionally as well. So just adding on to what they said. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Ron. All right. Chris, let's start with you on this. How can organizations strike the optimal balance between security and usability? How can you ensure security without compromising the delivery of care?
Sure. I'll say, Art mentioned it earlier, you know, they just want to get into it just like they do a workstation. So we try to mimic it with Imprivata to give them a badge tap access into these devices as well, whether it be a mobile handheld device that they can access, you know, their barcode scanners and do charting on, whether it be a vital signs monitor. We give them the ability to tap into that so that it does become seamless, very much like the workstation they have. I think whatever you're trying to mimic is just trying to basically take out the steps of that layer of security by replacing it with a badge tab and not counting keystrokes. And clinicians are horrible at counting keystrokes, and they'll let you know how many keystrokes the password is and how long it takes. And when you change it to a complex password, they'll be the first ones to complain as well, because that's what we do best, is complain. And I say that I'm a clinician, so but I think that balance is really tough to strike, because without it, you don't have any kind of firewall to your EMR. I mean, these devices are now connected. They're not just something that's out there, especially inside the clinics and ambulatory settings, that you now have access into your EMR, which can give quite a bit of information. So you do need the security there. You just need to be mindful of the fact that not to disrupt a workflow that's there. So when you really look at them and see what they do, how they access it, when they access it, and try to mimic that with the ability to, whether it be a badge tap or, quick sign in, sign out, so that they can do it effectively. That's how you try to decrease that compromise in care. Just make sure you continue the ease of access in the workflow.
Very good. Ron?
Yeah, I would, really great points. I would just say is that when we get into kind of security and balance, everything around the medical device environment, that the way we start that conversation is it's a safety conversation first. And that's really important, because when we're talking to the different constituencies, we like to have the safety conversation first and design for safety, which means we're going to take the security control and make sure that it has a safety context to it. In other words, the protection of the device. We don't want some type of malicious code or attack to disrupt in a particular point, at a point of care where it could be very disruptive for the clinician or harmful for the patient. So, and by the way, it's all about placement for these devices. They, depending on where they're at, depends on their criticality, right, or what they're doing. So it's really important to have the safety conversation first, design control robustness for safety, and then design for the rest, which is predominantly your privacy and confidentiality-based controls, which are these things that might integrate back into the EHR, which, by the way, has a safety component to as well. Data's got to get there. Telemetry data's got to get there. Nursing and other clinicians are using that type of data. It should be there, have high integrity and on time. So we try and design for those. And by the way, the conversation always shifts when you start talking about safety and not necessarily security at first. The conversation is much different with most of the constituencies, whether it's nursing, physicians, or your patient, the biomedical HTM staff, or your risk and patient safety staff. So it's really important to have that conversation first when doing control design, and that's what I would say about the balance, because that helps flesh out that balance quite a bit.
Very good. Art?
Yeah, there's not a whole lot to add to that to Ron or Chris's. I would just add that you're always sitting here evaluating the appropriate risk for an organization, and some of that you give up on either side of it. But ultimately, at the end, like everybody has said here, the goal is to make the information presented to the clinicians that are caring for the patient in a timely fashion, that it's not uninterrupted or altered in any state. So in other words, you haven't compromised the feed from the device by somebody doing a malicious act. And in particular, just making sure that those conversations are had in a clinical way, I think, is important, because a lot of times we come at it and start to look at it like the zeros and ones guys, and not understanding the workflow that actually happens from a provider standpoint, and understanding where they need to be and how they need to be, like typing in passwords. Imprivata's solution to getting in devices and desktops, when you start to look at that whole continuum there, it's really about timing and accuracy with the safety layered on it, like Ron mentioned. And if you provide that in an integrated solution, I think the clinical staff performs better, and then the patient care is ultimately a better quality.
Very good. All right, next question. We'll stick with you, Art. Can you provide some examples, I like this question, of security measures that could compromise clinical workflow efficiency and are thus inadvisable? Have you ever gone too far and then you realize that with some backlash and you say, okay, we got to dial it down a bit. We're not going to be able to lock things down as much as I'd like because it just doesn't work out on the floors?
On occasion, we tend to operate in a silo every once in a while, and the security engineers will flip on it. A simple thing like this is password management, and if you start to change the length of passwords or things like that, you start having people lock themselves out of the system at odd hours of the day. And if you make aggressive, quick, unthought about changes, and I think that's the overarching point. There's plenty of examples where we can be quick to react without being methodical and thoughtful of what that's going to impact. So, I mean, if you turn on password, complexity and you change that to more complex passwords, sure, we're talking about clicks and providers typing this in 100 times a day if you don't have some single sign-on, tap and go, or biomedical authentication process going on. That directly impacts the flow of patients, and then they start to forget things and lock themselves out of the system, and then you have patients that are sitting in rooms. So it's a really, and there's debates about passwords, and there's other examples of this, but when you start to think about what control you're going to put in and what process you're going to put in, you really need to understand the workflow. And sometimes we in IT, and I'm guilty of this myself, sit there and think, oh, this is a great solution. This is going to solve this problem. I'm not thinking what that provider is going to do on the floor in an ambulatory area or something like that. And those are critical areas to pay attention to. If you do not understand the clinical workflow, it really is tough, or have somebody that helps you with that, to design security around that flows correctly and allows the appropriate access and accepts the appropriate risk for the organization, which, we all understand that we're in a position to evaluate, accept, and remediate, risks to a point of making a balance. And I think that's our challenge most of the time, and I'm guilty of doing a whoops every once in a while with the team.
Well, I think we all are, for sure. Chris?
Sure. I'm going to share one story that we had implemented our solution at one hospital. I'll just leave them off the list for the name of them. But they recently just started using their Active Directory, and their big push was they wanted the clinicians to remember their Active Directory password. So instead of signing in once a day or 6 hours or every 8 hours, whatever, a controlled number of hours, they wanted to do it every hour. And they were requiring them to, badge in and type this so that they would get used to remembering their AD password since it was brand new to them. They just didn't realize prior to implementing this, the computers were wide open. They had never logged in this many times ever. In the first day, they logged over 500 calls because they were signing in, almost 8 to 10 times a day, every hour on the hour, or if they logged out an additional time. That was quickly thought of as a little aggressive in regards to a workflow efficiency. And I'll say this, you can always loosen the belt, you can't tighten it. So if there's a place to be, I'd rather have someone start off, with a very conservative look of it, and then, they can, why don't we do it at 4 hours or 8 hours or 6 hours, whatever that be. But if you try to take a 13-hour grace period and then say, we're going to ratchet that back to like 4, that you're going to get the same argument in a different way, that they're going to be upset that they're now being impeded. So it's easier to loosen that belt than to try to tighten it as the story goes.
Ron, what do you think?
Those are all good, and authentication is a big part of that. I could probably go through this a lot. I have a large laundry list of times I've broken medical devices along the way here at Texas Health Resources. Regrettably, I have too many lessons learned on it. So, data flow control, anytime you're modifying or changing data flow in the enterprise, whether it's trying to segment the network or zone the network, medical devices get hung up and caught up in that process because they might be in the wrong VLAN, they just weren't allocated right, presented right to the network, and no one knew what it was, so you end up breaking something. You Active Directory, when medical devices and a lot of their subsystems and ancillaries, let's say, are integrated into Active Directory, group policies, that we traditionally put around traditional IT assets. You start putting those around medical devices in inappropriate ways. You find that you can break a lot of things at the worst time, by the way. It will always break at the worst time. They'll always break when somebody is in a surgery room and having surgery. And that's like, and then all of a sudden things go awry. And I don't know why that is, but anyway, maybe that's because they're being used at that time. But so data flow control, GPO, Active Directory, those type of settings, we've seen that, and scanning. So what we've seen is we like to scan everything in our network. We have a big belief here that if you're on the network, you should be survivable. In other words, if you're directly integrated and not in a safe VLAN where we protect you from the rest of the network, then you have to be survivable. A lot of times we might have medical devices that didn't end up in the right places, and they don't take vulnerability scanning real well, and then the next thing you know, a scan hits it, and it kind of makes the machine fall down or create lots of latency in it. And I could go on with a laundry list of things that we've discovered and had to fix and put in real deliberate and detailed processes around. So we ensured we had high reliability around these assets. So for obviously patient safety and clinical workflows and all those things that go in that get caught up within that medical device realm. So like I said, I could talk about a lot of things that we've broken along the way, a lot of lessons learned, but those are some examples.
Excellent. Go ahead, Ron. Go ahead, Art.
Yeah, I know from Ron's perspective, when he mentioned scanning, we've had hiccups with that, and the other thing to consider, with the medical device process and scanning, is those middleware devices that are actually managing that data flow in there tend to actually be susceptible to the scanning process, and they're not really at times survivable on a scan. So we oftentimes are finding ourselves paying attention to the third party middleware that sits between us and that biomedical device to transfer that causes that. Scanning is intrusive for a reason, and a lot of times we're finding the vendors aren't exactly survivable with their design and build.
All right, very good. Now we are going to have a little fun here and go with our agree or over the top poll. So you should have seen that poll open. If you could answer that, we would appreciate it. The idea here is, do you agree with these statements or you think they're over the top? So first one, which I'm going to put in front of my friend Art, and it's a little tongue-in-cheek. Security must come first. Security professionals must be permitted to do whatever is necessary to ensure the ecosystem is not compromised, regardless of the impact on usability. You touched on this a bit before, but do you agree with that, or do you think it's a little over the top?
My ego agrees with it. I think it's over the top. We talk to be about a little reality here.
Perfect.
Yes, ego says, yep, that's me. It's all about me and what I need to protect. The real world says it's what Ron said was a balancing act with the safety and not compromising patient care and adequately accepting risk. So I'm going, that's over the top.
Okay, very good. Next one, we're going to go to Chris on this. Usability is sort of the other side, right? Usability must come first. Patient care is paramount, so clinicians cannot be slowed down by security measures. IT professionals must figure out how to secure things in the background without bothering the wonderful doctors and nurses. Christopher?
I feel like I hear that all the time. That's why we need a solution. From a clinician standpoint, I do think that there is a lot of truth in that. I do think that we need to be mindful of that. I do think there's also a little bit of ego there. Like, again, that vital signs is not going to be the end-all, be-all of what the patient's, daily outcome is going to be if it doesn't get pushed to the EMR. Now, if you can't get into it, then it does have a barrier. So there is going to be a balancing act there. I know we talked about that. I think that we need to be mindful to blend the two to get the real answer here. But as a clinician, I would say that the usability still has to be there. So I'm not going to go over the top. I do think that the clinicians need to be there. But I think it could very easily be pushed over the top because we can put our egos in the way too.
But you're going with an agree on that statement.
An agree. I'm going to go with an agree.
All right. I like that. I like that. It's very bold. And that means, of course, that Ron's going to take the last one. Breaches will happen, so focus needs to move from prevention to detection and remediation.
Yeah, this is a sticky one, but because we all believe that we can, and it goes back to what Art was saying, we all believe that we can control some of this and we can prevent breaches, but I don't think it's over the top. I think moving toward when you have a medical device domain where you don't have all of the same things in place you might have in other technology domains within the enterprise, I think moving to a detection and a remediation approach is definitely something that should be a focus. And at Texas Health, we definitely put that toward the top, and we collaborate deeply with all the partners I had mentioned earlier in ensuring that we have response plans in place and what we're going to do after the fact inside for the medical device domain, because we know what our limitations are. So I don't think it's over the top and totally appropriate to take that approach.
All right, very good. Let's end the poll here, and let's share the results. And we see that the results of the poll say for the first question about security must come first, 36% agree. So 36% are with you, Art. They're on board with you. 64%. Go ahead.
Or at least subscribe to my ego. That's one.
Yes, yes. 64%.
Art had a real strong position, I got to tell you. He came strong with that position.
I like that, right? It was very aggressive. We like that. 64% say that was over the top. The question number 2 about usability coming first. Only 45% agree. 55% say it's over the top. So, Christopher, you're in the minority on that one as a clinician. Maybe some non-clinicians on the line. Number 3, breaches will happen, so focus needs to shift to detection and remediation. 55% agree, 45% over the top. So close, but the majority going with agree. Next question, I want to go with Christopher here and give you an opportunity to ask one or both of your co-panelists a question.
Sure. We've talked today about kind of locking down the access to your EMR in regards to some of these devices, whether it be the Internet of Medical Devices, handhelds, or even like vital sign monitors. My question to both of you is are we just trying to lock down just the access to it, or are we really worrying about data integrity? Because I find that when I go out on the floors, and I've been to probably over 500 hospitals since I've started at Imprivata, a lot of these devices are just wide open. I'll just take a vital signs monitor, for instance. That's left open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. There is no real shutdown. So the one thing that I would challenge you with is, are we shutting it down just to shut it down, or are we shutting it down to get better data integrity? Because to me, if you know who's badged in and you know who's actually accessing it, or again, if it's accessing when someone's not there, again, whether we leverage beacon technology, or then we know something's going wrong with the patient. So the data integrity is my question to you. Do you think that we should be monitoring more for the data integrity, that we know who's in that device and who's monitoring it, or just to shut it down? What would you see your path being? More for data integrity or more for the security piece of it?
Let me go to Ron first.
Well, I think from my perspective is that, and I think you're getting at is some identity attribution associated with that data flow. Is that where you were going with that?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to that. Identity is the perimeter. So I think we need to know who's in. But I think we're losing something if we don't look for that. So I'm just curious where your minds are at.
Yeah, I can tell you from our perspective. I do think that we do have a focus on making sure data is getting from point A to point B with integrity. Now, attaching identity attribution is not something I would say that we have had a laser focus on, other than a couple different medical device areas, right? It's definitely not holistic. There are some areas where we've applied kind of the badge and identity process to where there was integration, but we haven't had a big leap into that. And by the way, I think there's some discussion that needs to be had when you get into identity and proofing and attribution within those medical device areas, and continuity all have to be addressed when you do that. So I think that type of initiative is very complicated And I think that's probably the reason why we haven't dove into that one depth, but not that it shouldn't, but I think we're more focused on just that strictly that point A to point B, making sure the data gets there correctly.
All right, great. Before we go to Art, I just want to remind anyone if they've got a question, just type it in the Q&A box and send it in. So Art, if you want to respond to Chris's question.
Yeah, no, I agree with Ron, and I think there's the identity part of it as well, you know, the data that's coming back and forth. I mean, I think we see some integration with EHRs where patients, you know, can move in the EHR and yet still remain attached to that device that hasn't been logged off or changed at the time. And then, you can see leads getting rehooked up, and, you know, the association's still with somebody that's on another floor and not down there because of workflows and disconnects and log-offs that we've seen in the past occasionally. So I think authentication plays a role. I think getting it to and from the EHR in an effective manner to the right patient and delivering that data is as well very important.
Very good. Ron, do you have a question for either or both of your co-panelists?
Yeah, Art, I would love to know. It looks like looks like you're doing a really great job out there. And you know, some of the things that we talked about a little bit today is this trade-off decision model. Is there a structure that you have in place at your health system where you're kind of taking these trade-off decisions in kind of a group of people, like a steering group or some type of structure where they're evaluating it as a collective to make decisions? Is there something that you're doing inside of your health system in that way?
Yeah, so security here is managed by a committee. We call it ISPOT, Information Security Privacy Oversight Team. So all applications and all products that come into Cambridge are evaluated by this team in a structured way, and that is the team that is made up of the Chief Operating Officer. It's made up of the CIO. It's led by me. It has marketing on there. It has purchasing on there. It has privacy compliance, security engineers, and operations. And ultimately what that is that accepts or rejects the risk for the organization. It's documented in a methodical way. It comes to us in a couple of ways. It comes to us from departments that want to buy technology, which then get redirected to the purchasing process and a value analysis process. And it also comes with us from the purchasing department, who also has our infrastructure review filled out on RFPs and purchases, and it's kind of the gatekeeper, and they're like, hey, we have these three products. Product number one has been chosen for this purpose, and they kick it to that committee, and you can't buy that here unless they sign off on it. And then we look at that from a holistic perspective, from the infrastructure perspective and the security perspective as well. We start to dig into those larger items and then render a decision, and that's where we accept or reject the risk. I mean, we've had some that come in here. It's just absolutely not. You're not putting this on the network, and we're not accepting it. And it's not meant to be a barrier. It's meant to help the process and actually have a vetted, documented solution that we've all accepted in case something down the road happens. You know, we're going to get asked from any OCR board or anything if we do have a breach, do you have a process, and did you go through that process? If you say, well, we kind of do, they're not really keen on that. But if we say, yes, we did, but this happened, it was not foreseen, they look at that as doing your due diligence. And I think that's important in any security program and or any program in general.
Very good. All right. Comment that came in. Difficult either at clinical engineering level or infrastructure level when recommending CE falling under infrastructure. I would find that a tough change potentially for both groups. Art, you want to comment on the comment?
Can you go with that one more time for me?
Difficult either at clinical engineering level or infrastructure level when recommending CE falling under infrastructure. I would find that a tough change potentially for both groups. Like a CE is clinical engineering. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Art.
So yeah, no, I would actually say that the ask is correct. So it boils down to culture. There's a lot of background that says that it should fall under the clinical areas and the clinical processes. and clinical engineering, because it makes sense to be there, but there's a large technological component of that that actually falls up now in this date and time underneath the infrastructure areas, underneath engineering and security engineering. And if you have the appropriate representation on that group from the clinical areas and that, I think you can make the transition. It's going to require some talk and some understandings and some guide rails, and actually to make that happen.
All right. Well, we're running close to the end of our time. Christopher, I want to give you a last chance to either comment on what the recent question or any overall final thoughts you have. I think, if I may, I think one of the interesting things here is that for folks like Art and Ron, and I think I'll let them add a comment too then as I think about it, is the fuzziness of getting their arms around this problem. I think security professionals like me, not that I'm a security professional, but I have this quality too. I like to get things organized in boxes, clean, checklists, get everything done. And Ron had mentioned at the beginning the difficulty of designing a system or a procedure or a way to sort of button this up, that it's just hard to get your arms around this. So if you want to touch on that or any final thoughts, and then I'll just hear quickly from the other gentleman. Go ahead.
Sure. Absolutely. So I'll bring up this one point because it kind of resonated when you guys were talking about it. It isn't, unless you have, like Art's layout, you have a very tight structure that you see everyone reporting to, and they bring into all those aspects of whether it be the clinical, whether it be to safety, whether it be quality. I find when I go out, I'll be asked to go speak to a physician's advisory committee. Just did it yesterday. The physicians needed to sign off on it. But then it also had to go to safety and quality. So there was another meeting that we did in a WebEx, and then had to be vetted by the security team, and then was the technology within their stack, and is it going to be okay to be in their roadmap? So there's like 5 or 6 different challenges to get that over the hump. If we can work together and bringing them, much like Art does, into a team approach where that you need to look at as a whole solution to get it there. I think the balance that we're striving for, to bring that security in and to bring the clinicians' thoughtfulness to make sure that they're not interrupted. That balance can be achieved if we start taking it as one meeting opposed to 22 meetings. And not that you're going to get everyone to agree to it, but you need to have a consensus across that very large swath of people that need to be signing off on it. So if we could get closer to that, I think we're going to get closer to solving some of the problems.
Final thought, Art?
Yeah, I'm very pro multidiscipline committees in this area. Which is why I have that one there. You have the key stakeholders, the key people that can make the decisions, and they're all in the same room, and they hear and see the same thing, and we move forward with that in order to keep the progress moving and no barriers in it. Some people tend to glass over a little bit when the security engineers gets into all of their widgets and stuff like that, but they do end up hearing value to that, and at the end result, from the end of the meeting, we come out of there with, a vendors come in, presented, the department's there, and they've got a decision. They walk out the door. There's not 15 other things to wait for over the next 3 weeks, and I think that keeps a health system and a security program as well as the clinical program moving forward a little bit faster.
Very good. Ron, final thought?
Sure. The first thing I would say is don't let headlines drive your medical device security program. Develop good, sound threat scenarios based on your environment, and let them guide the priorities in your medical device program. Don't chase headlines, chase the things that you need to get done in your enterprise, and be patient with those things, because not a lot of people have figured this out, so we're all in the same boat together. And lastly, I would just say, this is from experience, use both a top-down and a bottom-up approach to addressing medical device security. And that means, yes, have an executive stakeholder group that can fund, prioritize investments, and help do big trade-off decisions around risk. At the same time, have a good operational steering group that can deal with the details of availability, integrity, architectural design, compensating controls, who can answer those very deep and very complicated technical questions and kind of make them meet in the middle. So I would say you have to have both of those in place. So those are the two things I would just say, have them in place, and you should be able to kind of figure some things out after that once you get those things in place.
Excellent. Well, that's about all we had time for today regarding continuing education. Attending our events gets you 1 CEU towards the CHIME CHCIO certification program. So let CHIME know you were here, and if you've asked us to do so, we will. You'll receive an email when the on-demand recording of this webinar is ready for viewing. If you'd like to sponsor one of our upcoming events or book a custom event, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox from our team, and you can go to our website to register for our robust schedule of upcoming webinars. And with that, I want to thank our panel, Ron Mehring, Art Ream, and Christopher McKay. And I want to thank Imprivata very much for making this conversation possible. And of course, I want to thank our attendees for joining our events. So with that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.